Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Africa's Rare and Curious Creatures. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Lorraine Doyle. I'm Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Lorraine, take it away.
Hi, Rob. Thanks very much for that and for the opportunity to present. As always, it's a really cool thing to be able to do. So, I chose the topic for today um, largely because when people go on safaris, I think one of the things that everybody is looking for are what we would classify, I guess, as the big five. I call them the hairies and scaries. Um, and of course, those are an integral part of any safari to Africa. But I think there are a lot of other creatures out there which are really special in and of themselves in their own way. And I think that to be able to find some of these creatures when you're out on safari just adds another dimension to the whole experience. So I've chosen a sort of a real smorgasbord of creatures, a mixture of primarily mammals, but with a few reptiles thrown in as well. Um, just to kind of give an overall picture of sort of the biodiversity that's out there. I didn't include any birds in this one, but yeah, I think it's just to give sort of an overview of the other things that are out there that are not necessarily, the obvious creatures that we would expect to find on a safari. So, not to give anyone heart failure because I'm pulling up scientific cladograms, albeit very basic ones. But all I wanted to show through this is um, that when we're looking at some of these creatures, they're actually a lot more closely related to those animals which we would perhaps more obviously consider looking at when we go on a safari. And this is just quite a nice, simple version of just showing sort of a separation. And this is looking primarily, obviously, at, at carnivores, but looking at sort of two branches, one more cat related and one more dog related. Um, and what's quite interesting here is to see that if you look on the cat branch, that you see that things like hyenas, mongooses, and civets, which all of which I'll talk about a little more through the course of this presentation, are actually much more closely related to cats than they are to dogs. And that may surprise some people, especially when we look at things like hyenas. And then when we start looking at things like dogs, obviously canids being things like African wild dogs, some of our foxes, um, that you then actually start looking at things like um, weasel-like creatures, which are obviously a lot more dog-related. Um, and in that branch, interestingly, you go down into things that you would be seeing in North America, things like, your raccoons and your bears. But just to sort of give that overall picture, um, that these things are actually, in many instances, a lot more closely related than we realize. This one's just a little bit more detailed, but really is the same overall picture. Again, looking at carnivores, things that are more cat-like and more dog-like, um, and then things like civets and genets, which I'll talk a little bit more about tonight. Hyenas, which really are particularly unusual animals, because if you look at this, they're actually more closely related to things like civets and mongooses than they are to some of the bigger cats, and certainly than to dogs. And then right down at the bottom here, just looking at things like otters and badgers, and that includes things like um, some of our weasel-like creatures that we have here as well. So again, just a slightly more detailed version of it. Okay, so the first one, because I'm very fond of hyenas, be they spotted, be they brown, or be they some of the slightly more or exotic is probably the wrong word, but other members of the family, little things like aardwolf, which are extremely rare to see. But brown hyenas in and of themselves are also quite rare to find on safari. And part of that is that from a distribution point of view, they're relatively widely distributed across the southern African subregion, but they are more confined to dry, arid environments, and B, in areas where you have overlap between spotted hyenas and brown hyenas. Spotted hyenas will outcompete brown hyenas. They're bigger, they have much more powerful jaws, and they are, I would say, definitely more aggressive than things like your brown hyenas. So all of the hyenas that exist, and in modern hyenas, there's basically only 4 species: spotted hyenas, striped hyenas, the aardwolf, which I have seen in the past in places like Hwangi, which is one of the places we go to on Southern African Odyssey, but very rare to see, and strictly insectivorous. So it's become a very interesting sort of carnivore in that its teeth have become reduced and it's become something that really lives only on insects. And then you have your striped hyena, which is something that doesn't occur in the Southern African subregion. That's sort of further north in Africa, you would find your striped hyena. So the actual classification of brown hyenas scientifically has been fairly controversial for a long time. And there is still some ongoing dispute related to how it's classified. But all hyenas, as I showed in that diagram just now, are actually more closely related to things like civets and genets. And with the exception of the aardwolf, which, like I said, has got these reduced teeth, is essentially an insectivore, they have this incredibly unique ability to crush bone. And that is why when you're out and about on safari, whether you're looking at brown hyena or spotted hyena scat, you'll see that it's very white. And that's because they are able to crush bone. And so the scat is very high in calcium and phosphorus. And one of the things that's quite bizarre to see is things like leopard tortoises. You'll sometimes see them feeding on scat of hyena to get the relevant calcium and phosphorus for these shells that they might not be getting from the vegetation that they're eating. One of the other interesting things about brown hyenas that differs them from spotted hyenas is in spotted hyenas, it's a very strong matriarchal society. You have an alpha female who dominates everything, and male spotted hyenas have a fairly tough time in that they are outranked by even young females, cubs. Whereas in brown hyenas, in the clan, so that's what a collective noun for a group of hyenas is, there's actually an alpha male and an alpha female, and there's a much more collaborative raising of young than occurs in things like spotted hyenas. Female hyenas will usually remain within their natal clan. Males, even in brown hyenas, at some point, once they reach adulthood, will actually be kind of pushed out of the clan and may well become nomadic. And sometimes males will remain nomadic throughout the rest of their life. And there we go. So I was just showing these brown hyenas, which this is a demonstration of dominance between two relatively young brown hyenas. Um, so this is a dominance display. And so typically when brown hyenas are doing a dominance display, they prick their ears up like this, they sort of arch their back, they fluff up their tail, um, and the one that is sort of on the right hand side, ears back, almost not cowering, but that's a very submissive posture. Um, and so these are the kinds of things that are really interesting if you get to see these sorts of animals, to be able to spend time with them, to actually watch their behaviors. Um, and that's something that I always try to say to guests when we're on safari is, let's just sit with the animals for a little bit. You know, sometimes they're doing nothing at any given time, but often if you sit for a little while, you start to get to see these kinds of behaviors starting to manifest. And it just makes, watching the animals all the more interesting. So brown hyenas, like many carnivores, have a gestation period of usually about 3 months. And their litters are small, maybe one or two cubs will be born. What's also really interesting is that brown hyenas suckle their young for an incredibly long time, um, with youngsters actually taking milk for nearly 2 years. They will have some other intake of meat during that period, but it's a very long suckling period. And what's also interesting is in spotted hyenas, when they're actually born with their teeth erupted and pretty what we would call precocial, whereas brown hyenas are more what we would call altricial, so less developed, um, and they're actually born in a separate den, and they only come back to the main den site. The alpha female will bring them back to the den site, usually when they're about 3 months of age, and that's when they're actually introduced to the rest of the clan. So although they're all part of the same family, there are differences um, in many instances between um, the way that different um, members within that overall group actually behave. So I just think they're really cool. In parts of southern Africa, they're called strandlopers, which is Afrikaans for beachcomber or beach walker. And that's because in places like Namibia, they actually occur along the Skeleton Coast in the Namib Desert. And so they'll actually be on the beach, they'll scavenge. They've also been known to take young fur seals. And so, yeah, have a very, very interesting way of life. Not something that you really would see amongst spotted hyenas, at least. So the other one, and this photograph I actually took on the safari, the South African safari, which I finished just a few days ago. We were really lucky to see civets a couple of times, and that's really, really unusual. These are nocturnal creatures, and this was taken, it's certainly not an award-winning photograph. It was taken with a spotlight. The animal is actually black and white. They are somewhat raccoon-like in appearance, but they are in no way related to raccoons at all. So belongs to the family that includes things like genets, and also some animals from West and Central Africa, which I've certainly never seen, which are called linsangs. But that's the sort of grouping to which they belong. So nowhere close to any of your raccoons. It's also not related to a palm civet. So Um, in sort of northern Africa, you get these palm civets, but they belong to a completely different family, and there's really nothing that they have in common. Um, Not exactly sure. Perhaps physiologically, they resemble each other a little bit, in terms of what they look like, but there's certainly no relationship that they have. So, what's amazing about these creatures is they have a very unusual diet. Um, so, they are little carnivores, but one of the things that they are able to consume um, are millipedes. So, millipedes are invertebrates that are often red in color or black in color, have this sort of cylindrical shape to them, and some of the species actually produce or secrete hydrogen cyanide, which is obviously highly toxic, as well as hydrochloric acid. So those are the defense mechanisms of those particular invertebrates. And as a result of that, most animals give them a wide berth. They're just like, not eating these. They're not going to taste very nice, and B, they're just downright poisonous. Um, but African civets have actually have got the ability to consume these animals and actually to neutralize those toxins. The exact mechanism of this is not fully understood, but you only have to see what's known as a civetry. So these animals actually use like a communal latrine to defecate in, which is known as a civetry. And it is full of the exoskeletons, these little round exoskeletons of millipedes, which is testament to the fact that they seem to be able to eat them with absolute impunity. They've actually also been seen, there's a genus of trees in Africa called strychnos. And as the name suggests, that actually the fruits contain strychnine, which is another highly, highly toxic substance. And yet these creatures, once more, seem more than capable of consuming these fruits and having basically no impact on them whatsoever. What's also interesting about these animals is they produce quite a noxious pasting substance called civetone. And for a very long period of time, civetone was actually used as a fixative in perfumes because it stays on surfaces for an incredibly long time, which is one of the things when an animal is pasting to mark its territory, it doesn't want it to just wash away. But civetones seem to be particularly um, pungent, if you will, and also have this longevity in terms of how long it would stay around. And so it would be diluted down greatly and then actually used as a fixative for perfumes. Commercially now, manufacturers now use something called, I think it's called ambratone, and that's a synthetically manufactured version of this, which they still use as a fixative for perfumes. The other thing about civets, so there are other species of civets, not in southern Africa, but in places like South America. And some of the world's most expensive coffee actually comes from civet scat. So in South America, their species are actually fed coffee beans, and the processed coffee beans are then harvested and used to make apparently some of the world's most expensive coffee. It doesn't happen with our civets, and it's not something that I have ever either seen or experienced, so I can't comment on it, but it is widely reported that this takes place. So really cool little animal to see with this cute little mask and these beautiful black and white markings. So Genets are another little nocturnal creature that we sometimes see while we're on safari. And they're one of my favorites. They erroneously get called civet or genet cats. Sometimes civets are also called civet cats. Neither of them are cats. They both belong to the family Viveridae. Um, but these are sort of almost cat-like in their face, but yet they have this sort of long, slender body that almost makes them look a little bit like a mongoose. Um, but they're actually really interesting little creatures. We've had a few cases at Tunda where I'm based where we've actually had some that we were rehabilitating. Unfortunately, sometimes people think these animals make good pets, which they do not, and then they can't look after them. And so then we sometimes get them to rewild them. And they are probably some of the most efficient rodent killers I have ever watched. Um, so, yeah, they will dispatch a rodent in a matter of seconds. It's not the only thing that they eat. They will also, take other small, they'll take small reptiles, other small rodents. But they really are um, really, really good ratters. Um, So this little one, I think I took this photograph, not on this secluded South Africa trip, but another one. Um, and they are frequently seen in trees. Um, and they are very agile and spend the day usually holed up, um, like this little one had been holed up in a tree. And then at night, sort of as the sun sets, they then start to come out. There's been quite a lot of change amongst the classifications within the species of genets that's still ongoing. Um, this one is basically a large spotted genet, sometimes called a rusty spotted genet. And this one is the one that is most commonly found throughout sort of southern sub-Saharan Africa. Again, you can see has this lovely little white markings under the eyes, very typical of any nocturnal animal, helps reflect light into the eyes, as opposed to things like cheetahs, for example, which have just purely dark lines, which help because they are diurnal. That actually helps reflect glare so they don't actually get glare in their eyes when they're hunting. It was quite interesting on this last secluded South Africa trip when we were coming into camp one evening at Mala Mala. There was a little genet sitting on the wall of sort of by reception as we drove in, and it sat there for a couple of minutes and then it darted off. But yeah, really, really nice little carnivore to be able to see. So then another unusual creature that we don't get to see that often is this little creature called a bat-eared fox. Obviously, it has these enormous ears, and its name actually means or comes from otos, meaning ear, scion means dog, and mega is big. So it's an eared dog with big ears. So it's a really interesting little animal in that it specializes purely in eating things like termites, ants, grubs, sometimes under the ground. And what it does is it will walk along with this sort of quite hunched posture with those ears flat down towards the ground. And it can actually hear the movement of these insects underground. And then what it will start to do, it will then start to dig like crazy to then excavate whatever it is that they're looking for. One of the reasons that we don't see them very often is distribution. So they prefer sort of semi-arid areas. They're generally nocturnal, but also their populations have quite pronounced what we would call bottom-up and top-down regulation. So bottom-up regulation means that their numbers are controlled by the number of termites, the abundance of termites and food sources. And then also the top-down regulation is things like the number of black-backed jackals, which will certainly outcompete them and potentially kill them as well, because they occur in similar areas. And they would sort of both be classified as what we would call mesocarnivores, so sort of mid-level carnivores. And it's quite interesting because one of the places we go to on secluded South Africa is called Marataba. And historically, we've seen not a lot of them, but we've seen them quite frequently. And since the recent heavy rainfall that we've had over this last season, there's been a significant increase in the number of black-backed jackals. And what I've noticed is that there's been a significant decrease in the number of sightings we've had of bat-eared foxes. Now, I know that correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation, but I think that based on the literature as well, I think there may be some link between the rise in numbers of jackals that we've been seeing and the decline of bat-eared foxes. So they have a large number of teeth. I think it's something like 42, and more teeth than any other non-marsupial land mammal. And that's because their teeth have just become reduced to these sort of little pegs, because that's all they really need to grind up the insects that they eat. So they have very blunted molars, which crush rather than shear, as you would expect normally to have a carnassial shear in a carnivore. So they've become very well adapted to their diet. But I just think they have the most cute faces, this little Zorro mask, and this very fluffy tail. So another group of little carnivores that are again fairly closely related are the mongooses. Now, a lot of people will know mongooses through meerkats. I think the program Meerkat Manor a few years ago made them quite popular. But they're all related. They're all part of this group of animals called the mongooses. And apparently the plural of mongoose is mongooses, not mongoose. I don't know who made that decision, but that's apparently the correct term. There's also some fun collective nouns for animals, and one of them for mongooses is, we talk about a business of mongoose, and that's actually quite appropriate for mongooses because they actually are fairly busy and also quite nosy, sticking their noses into other people's business. This particular mongoose is a solitary mongoose. So some of the members of the family, like dwarf mongoose, banded mongoose, and meerkats, are much more gregarious. You find them in large groups. But this particular mongoose is solitary, and you don't actually see them that often. But they are the most arboreal of all of the mongoose species. So they're really good at climbing. And recently seen them like climbing up trees and hearing flocks of starlings going absolutely crazy. And it's because there was a slender mongoose which was trying to get into the nesting hole where the starling obviously had eggs or nestlings. And so this mongoose was being dive bombed to try and get it out of the nest area. So yeah, they have this long, slender tail. Often, if they do stand still long enough to get a photograph for, um, they'll have that sort of black tip of the tail flicked up, and that's quite common and quite diagnostic. They also, like all mongooses, they have this ability to stand up, just like meerkats do. And yeah, they have this very kind of alert posture, which they will look out, often looking for danger. And in the gregarious species, like meerkats or banded or dwarf mongoose, they'll actually have one of them on, or maybe a couple, acting as lookouts, who will then, if there's any form of potential predator approaching, they will then alarm call, and then everybody will dive for a burrow. What's interesting about these creatures is that they definitely have different vocalizations for different predators. And so there may be one for an aerial predator like an eagle, a different one for a snake, and possibly a different one for another carnivorous mammal that may pose a threat to them. So yeah, very intelligent creatures. And yeah, vicious little carnivores. So when people see them, especially things like little dwarf mongoose, I mean, they are very cute, until you see them yawn and you see their teeth, and then you realize that actually they really are quite vicious little carnivores. So I just wanted to put in just another kind of cladogram just to show things. The next creature really, which I just wanted to chat about, which is the one second to the bottom here, under the group Pholidota, and that's the pangolins. And specifically here, one that we get in the Southern African subregion, known as Temminck's pangolin, sometimes gets referred to as the Cape ground pangolin or just the ground pangolin. But yeah, the only one that we have in the Southern African subregion. So the name pangolin actually comes from a Malay word, which means roller. And that's really the stance that a pangolin will take in self-defense. So I've been involved a number of times in helping to rescue tagged pangolins, and I'll show you a photo just now of a pangolin that's tagged. And the reason that they are tagged is because they are one of the most trafficked animals on the planet. Not specifically or not just Temminck's pangolins. So there are other species of pangolins. There's other species in other parts of Africa, and then another 4 species that occur in Asia, all of which are tree dwelling or arboreal. But as a group, they are incredibly highly trafficked. And as a result of that, where there are known pangolin populations, there is research being done in many cases on them. And so they have these little tags on them, which allow researchers to track them, to know where they are, and to be able to, as a result of that, to be able to learn more about, their behavior, their habits, and so on. So unfortunately, the reason they are so highly trafficked is they are highly prized in certain cultures for their meat, and also for their scales. So they are essentially the only animal in the world that is completely covered by scales, and yet they are mammals. So their scales are not the same as reptile scales. They are compressed hair. So it's exactly the same stuff as your hair or your fingernails, as is rhino horn. So it has no specific values. It has no medicinal values. I always say to people, the only value or the only thing that has any use for a rhino horn, for example, is a rhino. And the same goes for pangolin scales. They are useless to anything except a pangolin. But unfortunately, from a cultural and medicinal perspective, that is not always appreciated around the world. So I was talking about the tags that they have on them. So this photograph was actually taken quite a long time ago. The tags have actually got quite a bit smaller. And the reason that there are two tags, so one is a GPS or a satellite tag, and the other one is what we call a VHF or very high frequency tag. And there's a need for both of them. So when the animal goes below ground, which is what pangolins do for a large part of the day, they're only active, usually only active late at night. Once they're below ground, then your satellite tag has absolutely no use. It cannot pick up anything. But it is great for when they are above ground, being able to get a good and an accurate location on them. The VHF tag uses radio telemetry equipment, which enables you to narrow down where they are and enables you to find them more easily should you need to be tracking them. I know these look particularly, like I said, quite cumbersome. They have become a lot smaller, but certainly from the work that has been done on pangolins, it doesn't seem to have any deleterious effect on them, and certainly not to the point where it really negatively impacts them. So interestingly, about 20% of a pangolin's weight is actually made up of its scales. And as you can see, they have this long tail, quite a pronounced body, and then this very, very small little head. So this was one that we were involved in rescuing. His name was Gomo, and he was a pangolin that liked to go walkabout. So he'd been released on a reserve neighboring Tunda where I'm based, but he decided that he didn't like staying there. And we think he was actually tracking a female. And so Gomo used to disappear. He would dig under the fence and he would pop up somewhere on our property. Problem is that it's very, very rocky and hilly here, and he would find his way into the most inaccessible areas. We would then have to go and look for him at night, pick him up, so he would roll himself up into a ball, put him into a bag, and then carry him down the mountain to take him home again. So we had to do that maybe twice, and then I think he decided that staying where he'd been put was more acceptable, and he hasn't been visiting since. But what you can see here are the very, very sharp edges on these scales. So when they roll shut, those actually can cut really quite badly as they close. The other thing you can notice are the incredibly long nails, and those are used for digging. And so they dig into soil to excavate the termites and other creatures that they are looking for. So this was just him once he'd been put into his box for relocation. And then shortly after this, he just curled himself up and he was quite happy to be taken back to where he'd come from. But as you can see, they sort of have these incredible overlapping scales, which just forms this armor that obviously is a very, very strong protective coat. The only vulnerable portion being their underbelly, which is why they roll themselves up into a ball to try and protect themselves. So until this most recent trip, which ended a couple of days ago, the only pangolins I had ever seen in the wild were these pangolins, which were tagged and which we were tracking and retrieving. So when we were at Marataba the other day, and the guests, I think, I'm not quite sure what they thought I'd seen, but we were driving along the road during daylight hours. It was quite chilly and overcast, and I suddenly yelled, "Stop!" And initially I thought, oh dear, I've told them to stop for a piece of wood. And then I realized I actually had seen what I thought I had seen. And it was the first wild pangolin that in 20 years of doing this work I have ever seen. Just to give you an idea of how rare these creatures are to see in the wild. So it was on its way walking, and it then went and buried itself, as they do in this sort of clump of bushes. And I managed sort of to get just one sort of peak shot through the bushes of its little face. Um, what's really cool about this is that although we had guests there and we let people get off the vehicle to view it, it never felt threatened enough to roll up into a ball. So we were respectful enough of its sort of comfort zone. And that's always a thing to really consider when you're viewing animals like this, is you don't want to disturb them, you don't want to stress them. And so the fact that this animal was happy enough for us to view it from a distance and not actually curl up into a ball, which is what they do when they're threatened, um, just made this a really, really special experience. So, yeah, that's something I'll certainly remember for a long time. And then just in the last few minutes, I know that reptiles are often not something that people really consider something they want to see on their safari. But I think it's quite important that we have some understanding of how important they are in the overall picture of healthy ecosystems and making up a biodiverse environment. And the only reason I wanted to show you this is that I want to show you just three things really quickly. So one of them are monitor lizards, which you can see here on this sort of cladogram. And the only reason I wanted to put this in here was just to show the link between monitor lizards and snakes. And that's because monitor lizards are much more closely related to snakes than they are to any other lizard. Now, we have two species in southern Africa. This one here is a rock monitor, and then I've got some pictures of a Nile monitor. They are direct relatives of the Komodo dragon, and so actually are part of what we would call a venom clade. So although yes, they do have bacterium in their mouths, which undoubtedly in things like the size of a Komodo dragon can cause significant problems. Ours are much, much smaller. To sort of give you an idea, this is a Nile monitor or a water monitor. You can see it's got this lovely flat tail for swimming, has this beautiful coloration. But the main reason for this photograph was just to show you the forked tongue. Other lizards do not have forked tongues. They have flat tongues without any fork in them. And this is something that is part and parcel of their being part of or having close relationships to snakes. So what they do with that forked tongue is they actually use that for smell detection. So what they do is they put out the tongue, they pick up scent molecules on those two forks. They then insert it into an organ in the roof of their mouth called Jacobson's organ, which allows them to smell which direction, whatever it is they're wanting to feed on, is based. So it allows them to know whether their prey is left or right of where they are, and that's exactly what snakes do. So they do have some venom, certainly. I actually know somebody who a while ago he was trying to rescue one, and it bit him. And he just said he experienced where the bite wound was, it just bled profusely. So there's obviously some sort of an anticoagulant in there. And that's also been documented in bites from Komodo dragons. And this was just another angle on it. Just an incredibly long tongue. For You can also have a look. They have very, very powerful claws and feet. And so, yeah, they're not really something that you would want to go and pick up, but they're really, really interesting animals to watch. And then I may have some people running for cover, but I just wanted to mention puff adders simply because they are truly a remarkable stealth predator, and something that I think we underestimate, certainly in the control of things like rodent populations. And what's really incredible about them is the fact that they practice something called chemical crypsis. And so what this is that they don't actually have any intrinsic body odor. So we obviously have an odor. Every animal that we think of has an intrinsic odor. Puff adders do not. And this work was found out through a research lab in South Africa. And what they did was they got puff adders and other snakes to crawl over fabric. And they then took this fabric and they hid it, and got sniffer dogs in to see if they could detect it. So every time the sniffer dogs found everyone except the one the puff adder had crawled over. So then they said, okay, well, maybe this is a bit unnatural. You're not going to have dogs in the wild. So they used meerkats. Very highly developed sense of smell. They actually hunt snakes as well. Same story happened. They couldn't find the puff adder. And then the final animal that they used to test this was elephants, because they have the most developed sense of smell. And exactly the same thing happened. They could not find the one that the puff adders had been over. And if you think about it, it makes absolute sense, because this is how puff adders hunt. They are ambush predators. So they coil themselves up in leaves and they wait for something to come past. They don't actively go and forage for it. And so if you have an intrinsic odor, your prey has got a highly developed sense of smell. Well, there's every good chance that it's going to smell you and you're not going to get a meal. And so subsequent to this, more work is being done on other ambush predators. And we're finding similar results are coming out, that these creatures that use this methodology don't actually have an intrinsic smell. And then one last one that I think people will think are probably cute rather than scary are chameleons. We have a number of different species of chameleons, but this is the most common one in southern Africa. The flat-necked chameleon, so called because of the sort of flap on the back of its neck that you can see there. And so it's actually the word chameleon is actually a Latinized form of an ancient Greek word that comes from two portions, one kami, on the ground, and leon is lion, and it sort of translates to a ground lion. And I think it's to do with the sort of intimidating defensive display where it kind of hisses and it gapes and it'll sometimes lunge at things. And so I think that's probably how they came to the name. So you'll see all of these photographs have been taken at night, and that's because chameleons are much more easily found at night with a spotlight than they are during the day because of their ability to camouflage themselves. So when you're out at night on a night drive, it's always really good to look into the bushes, especially down by rivers, and see if there's some sort of area of green that just really doesn't look like the rest of the leaves. And not infrequently, it turns out to be a chameleon. So either sleeping or sometimes still foraging, although they do primarily forage during the day. This one, I think we'd found, was actually sort of coiled up and sleeping. This one was slightly more awake. And as everybody knows, they have this ability to change color. They have these eyes, which are almost on turrets, so that they can actually have really wide range of vision without moving their heads very much. And then just lastly, this photo I just loved because I thought it really does look like quite an intimidating little creature, albeit with its little hands or feet sort of coiled up over the branches that it was staring out at us from. I think chameleons are incredible creatures. I think we have a fairly good assemblage in Southern Africa. The most by far globally are in Madagascar, including the world's largest and the world's smallest chameleons. But I just would like to hope that through this evening, I've just been able to share some of the other things that are out there that are really interesting and fascinating in the African bush. Thanks very much, Rob.
All right, Lorraine, thank you so much. All right, before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everybody that if you do have questions, that you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. Just go to the upper right-hand corner and click on those three lines. It'll pop down a menu, go to questions, and that's where you can submit them. So we have a question about your pictures, Lorraine. This guest is wondering, do you carry a portrait or a macro lens in your bag?
No, I don't. No, none of those were taken with a macro.
All
So
right.
just taken either, so yeah, just with my normal lenses, but yeah, not a macro lens.
Gotcha. Thanks for clarifying that. So many of the earlier animals shown had very long tails. Is this a coincidence? Is there a reason for that?
So a lot of them, because um, many of them have some form of arboreal portion to their lifestyle. Animals that have an arboreal lifestyle will often have a relatively long tail. Sometimes that tail is prehensile, sometimes it's not, but it often gets used for balance when animals are climbing. So yeah, things like mongooses, genets, for example, all climbing, and so therefore they have this tail which assists them with balancing.
Gotcha. Thank you. Are pangolin scales shed, and do those scales come back?
No, they don't shed scales. Um, so yeah, those scales basically grow as the pangolin grows, and they just increase in size. Um, and so if they're damaged, um, they actually don't grow back. They wear down along the edges like our fingernails do. Um, but I mean, if they were to like lose a great number of them, it's problematic. It would form quite a significant wound on the animal.
Gotcha. Thank you. Did the pangolin you saw in the wild, did that have a tag on it?
No, it was untagged. It was an untagged pangolin. So,
Gotcha.
which was even more cool.
Is there any worry about their habitat being taken away at this time?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think for all species that are kind of still in the wild, habitat loss is a significant problem. not only in Africa but globally. But I don't think that their habitat loss is their biggest challenge. Their biggest challenge is humans, taking them for, whether it's for scales or meat. Um, so yes, habitat loss across the board is problematic, but in their case, it's not as significant as for something like cheetahs, where habitat loss is a big problem.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for clarifying that. We've got a lot of comments. People have really loved this presentation and love the fact that you focused on some of the lesser known animals. We have one guest who has traveled to Africa a few times and was really excited to see some of these smaller animals that we don't talk about as much as the big five. So, but unfortunately, that is the last question that we do have for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I mean, if there are questions that people have, I'm more than happy if they get emailed. I'm more than happy to try and answer them. Um, so, and yeah, just to say thanks very much again for allowing me the platform to present. It's always a real pleasure. So thank you.
And Lorraine, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel to Africa with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this next week's lineup, including our registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.